In this web development tutorial, we will learn how to implement authorization, that is access control, in NestJS project. We are going to look at this using 3 different approaches. In the previous lesson, we've seen how to implement authentication, hash and store password, issue JWT token, protect routes by validating the JWT, and so on and so forth. The previous video focused on user authentication. In a similar way, we are going to focus on user access control. When we talk about user access control or authorization, we often refer to an authenticated user, because after the authentication, we now have access to the authenticated user and we can check what privileges they have. In the application, we have a user that makes a request. First, we check whether this user is authenticated. If the user is not authenticated, we return a 401 status code saying you are not authorized. However, if this user is authenticated, we come to the layer we want to introduce now, which is authorization, access control. Here, we check if the user has the privileges to access the given resource. If the user does not meet the authorization requirement, we return a 403 forbidden, saying you are forbidden to access this resource. However, if the user meets the requirement, the user is able to access the resource. Talking about the different approaches we are going to implement. First, we are going to look at what is called role-based access control. Let's move on the right-hand side here. Here we have a user. We are going to have 2 more entities, role and permission, such that there will be many-to-many relationship between user and role, and in a similar way, many-to-many between role and permission, and optionally, we also have this relationship between permission and user. The first one, that is role-based access control, we basically check if this user has the required role. For example, the user tries to access this resource, and to access this resource, we need the user to have admin role. So in this case, we check if among the roles assigned to this user is admin among them. If that condition is met, the authorization will pass. The next type of authorization we are going to look at is claim-based authorization. In this case, we check for a specific permission. Now think of 2 users, user A and B, that have the same role. Both of them have admin role, manager role, whatever the role. It therefore means that going by the first approach, these 2 users have the same privileges. But let's imagine a more flexible scenario whereby user A and B can have different permissions. In this case, what we check is the permission assigned to the user. Now, this can go in different ways. For example, we can attach permissions to roles and then roles to user. This, I think, is the most common way to do it. But I also want to include an example where we can directly attach permissions to the user. Because if we go the roles route, it means that if user A and B have exactly the same roles, they also have the same permissions. Although we can assign like admin and editor to user 1, to user A, and assign only editor to user B, in that case they will have different permissions. But I just want to demonstrate this flexibility as well. Finally, and the third approach we are going to take is to look at more fine-grained authorization. Now think of a user profile, an entity user profile. We've checked, for example, that user A has the required role to access user profile. If we go by permission, we can check something like whether the user A, has the permission to access user profile. So if we have two users, A and B, that can access user profile, it therefore means that both A and B can access this user profile. Let's just switch to edit, not access. But what if we want a case where user A can only edit their profile, but user B cannot edit the profile of user A? In that case, for example, we can check the user ID of that profile. So both A and B can edit profile, but they can only edit their own profile. When we get to this fine-grained access control, we are going to make use of a library known as CASL. With this, the implementation is more straightforward. Like I already mentioned, that in the previous lesson, we implemented authentication. This is the Git repository for that authentication. And I also said that for user access control, we want to have authentication already implemented. So what I've done is to set up a starter project for this authorization by making a copy of this authentication example with a little adjustment. This is the new repository for starting the authorization. I will go ahead and clone this authorization example starter project. So git clone, and let me go into the project and open that in my code editor. This is a copy of the authentication tutorial with little adjustments that are not about the authorization. For example, here I change this to true for more strict null checks. And in the user service, I added this method for update user. And I think that's just the main changes here. In the auth module, in the strategies, I changed the return type. So this is what I'm returning now. I think before I was returning the user object. And yeah, those are like the main changes. There could be other things, but they're not really talking about authorization. To make all these errors go away, I need to do npm install to install the packages. With the packages installed, I will run the project and test some of the authentication endpoints that we implemented in the previous lesson. Npm run start dev, and I think I have an error. So this error is because I need to create a .env file. Let me stop this and create that file. I have an example.env file. I will create a .env file from that example. Have a .env. Let me check what I need to put in the .env file. Just JWT secret. You put your super secret. I will leave this the way it is. Back to the terminal. I'll try to start the application again. Run start dev. Now we go to Postman and try to, I'll call the endpoints that we have from the previous lesson. The first one is to sign up, to create an account, and we have that success. The next thing I want to do is, let me call the get users. I get unauthorized because this user is not logged in. Then I will log in, get the JWT token, and call a protected route. I get 401 because it says the account for John Doe is not active. Let me quickly change that to active. Go over here. I have a user, John Doe, and I will change the account to active. So when I find users now, I will get the list of users. And to get the authenticated user, which right now is the same user, I get this. So we still have the endpoint from the previous lesson working. The next thing I'm going to do is to define these entities and the relationships. So we are going to have role and permission in addition to the existing user entity. And we also define the relationship between these entities. If you want to learn in depth about entity relationships, you can check one of my previous NestJS tutorials that went in depth into all that. So I will assume that you already know about entities and relationships in relational database. And that's what we are going to go straight to and define them. In this auth module, let me have entities. I'm going to have row.entity.ts. And inside here, I'm going to have just going to have ID field, the name of the row. This, we're not going to use this. I'm not sure why I added it. And then relationship between the row and user. This is a many-to-many relationship. That is, a row can be assigned to multiple users, and the user can have multiple rows. Again, I've covered all these in one of my previous lessons. We're also going to have permissions. I mentioned that we can have a case where permission is directly assigned to a user. And that's what this permissions relationship is about. So let me go ahead and create that file for permission. Permission.entity.ts. In permission, we are going to have the primary ID column and the name of the permission. I have an enum for this. If I go to this is one of the changes I made from what we have in the auth lesson, authentication lesson. I added this enum and defined a few permissions for demonstration. I did a similar thing for row. I have this user, editor, and admin. What is wrong with this file? Let me close and open it again. Okay, I have permission. I'm not sure what the problem is. This is called permission. This here should be permission. Let me see what difference. That's weird. Then I'll go to users and define this relationship with rows. My user entity will now look like this. In user, we've added the relationship many-to-many between user and rows. And as already explained, we also have this relationship between user and permissions. Now we have the relationship between the three entities. I will also update the user service to select those relationships. So in the find one user, I am joining the rows and permission so that when I fetch a user, I will also retrieve those data, those information. Also here, when I update a user, I want the ability to update rows and permissions. So I will go to update user DTO and add those fields. I've added those two fields and the error should go away. With these changes in place, I'll go ahead and delete the database. So to be recreated, stop this and start. I'm going to have a fresh database and I can go to Postman and recreate the user and all that. But I don't want to keep doing this every time I make this kind of change. So what I'm going to do is to have a module, let's call this a helper module sort of, that is going to populate the database with the test information. It's not really part of what we are doing, but just to save us the time of having to recreate things. Well, let me stop this server and generate that module. NestJS resources. I'll call it demo. I'll call it demo helper. That will be the module. Yes and yes. I'll go to the demo service. Let me go to the service. Let me actually delete these spec files. In demo service, I'm going to remove this auto-generated and have this method. So this method is going to set up the database basically. For the demonstration, what does it do? It's going to create a number of permissions, insert those records in database, create some rows, that is to insert some rows in the database, and create 3 different users that are assigned the 3 different rows. That's what this helper method is going to do. And these private methods are just for creating the records. So I'm going to have at the end of the day a user, John Doe, that is assigned the role admin, editor, and user, and has some permissions directly assigned to it according to the relationship that we define in the entity file. And then I'm going to have another user, Lucy, and Lucy doesn't have any permission directly assigned to it, but of course inherits the permissions from the assigned roles. Finally, I'm going to have Zest, and this user has only the user role. Let's also update the helper module. We are going to expose one endpoint that when we call, it's going to populate the database with the test records we just saw. And this is going to be for demonstration purposes only, and I'm making it public because I don't need to require authentication for this. Finally, we update the helper module. Here we are updating the imports array. I will start the server again and we test this endpoint. So over to the terminal, npm run start dev. Now I'll go to Postman. Before that, if I try to find users again, of course, there's no record at all. And if I try to log in, the same thing. There's no need to register because this is going to create some users for us. I will call the endpoint and we get the result. So these permissions have been created. The same thing with the roles. We have admin, we have editor, and we have user, each with assigned the mapped permissions. Then we have the users. This is the admin, this is editor, and user, normal user. I'll go ahead to log in with John Doe, which is the admin person. Send off this request. What just happened? I think I know what happened. In this demo helper, the password is secret, not what I have right now. So change this to secret and log in. We get the JWT, which is automatically set as an environment variable, which is that this is a Postman feature. So there's no need to manually copy these things over. If I now go to get users, I can get the list of users. And of course, I can find the authenticated user. In this case, is John Doe. And we can see that relationship we mapped. For example, John Doe, that is admin, has all the roles assigned to the person. And each row has permissions mapped to them. But you can also see that this user has permissions directly assigned to them according to the relationships we define here. Now let me try something else. I'm going to log in with a different user. I think, what's the name? Just pick anybody. This user that has the least privileges. I'll copy this username and come over here, log in with that user. At this point, the JWT is updated in the environment variables. And if I go here, you can see we get the different user. This user has only this one row, and the row coincidentally has only one permission mapped to it. This user does not have any permissions directly assigned to it, but this user and the admin have equal access. You can see they can all access the list of users. And this is where access control comes in. We want to, for example, say that if the user does not have admin role, they should not be able to access this resource. Or if the user is not assigned a specific permission, for example, read user or manage user permission, they should not be able to access the user's endpoint. With this in mind, let's start with role-based access control. Let me create the rows decorator file, rows.decorator.ts. What I want is to have something like this. We go to the route we want to require certain rows, and we can say at rows and not that client row dot admin, for example, client row dot editor. So in this case, the user should have either of these rows to be able to access the endpoint. Back to this decorator, I'm going to say export const, let's call this rows to be equal to set metadata rows decorator key. In the second argument, let's take the rows. This will come in as the rows we've seen in the controller, which can be multiple. So let's call these rows using the REST syntax, and we unpack this into an array of client row. So this is the guy we are going to pass over here. I'm going to use this guy somewhere, so let me export a constant for that. Export const, we'll call this rows metadata key to be equal to this. I'm going to have it here, rows metadata key. Now I can go back and remove this guy and import that metadata file. At this point, we have passed some metadata, but we have not really done anything with it. That means if I go back to this endpoint, if I call this endpoint, it works the same like before. Even though this user, let me see the user in question does not have any of the specified rows. What we need to do next is to create a guard. Let me go to guards. I'm going to have rows.guard.ts. Like the other guards, we're going to export class rows guard, which implements can activate. We need to implement the required method can activate. In the constructor, I want to inject the reflector. With this, we can read the metadata information that we passed to this example here, endpoint. Private reflector Now we can use the reflector to get the required rows. So const required client rows equals this dot reflector dot not that dot get and override rows metadata key context dot get handler and context dot get class. So this is expecting to return boolean. Let me just make that error go away. Not that. First, I want to check whether the route in question even has the decorator applied. So for example, if this has nothing, it means it doesn't require any rows. So if not required rows or required rows dot length. By the way, this is going to get us an array, client row array, or I think undefined, yeah, something like that. So if we don't have client rows or the length is 0, we just return true. What the heck is that? Return true means it passes because there's no specific requirement. There's no row required to access that endpoint. Now we can access the user that made this request and see what permissions the user has. So we say context dot switch to http dot get request. This will give us access to the request object, and we say that user, if you could recall in the authentication that when the local strategy, where is it, strategies, out, guards and strategies, in this local strategy, whatever that is returned is attached to the request object as the user, and that is the user we are going to access from here. Let me type in this user is going to be partial of user type to be equal to request.user. So instead of returning false here, I'll change this in a moment. Dot sum is going to be user.rows.sum row. We basically check if the user has any of the required rows. So required client row dot include the row, the user row dot name. So this is going to be user dot rows, and this will return true if the user rows has any of the required rows. For this guard to start working, what we need to do is to go to app module and apply that guard. So provide app guard, use class rows guard. Now I'll go back to the client Postman and try to get the list of users. Why do I have an error? Let me check why I have this error in the guard. Get and override the reflector. Oh, I think because this needs to be declared as injectable for NestJS to manage the dependency injection. And I'll go back and call this endpoint. We have the authenticated user, which is this user that has only permission, not permission, we're not talking about permission now, has this row. What the heck? The row is user. If I try to call this endpoint now, we get a 403 forbidden because this user does not have any of the required rows. By the way, let me turn off this guy and run this from VS Code so we can visualize this better. This is the rows guard, and I'll put a breakpoint here. I will run from VS Code. The debugger is attached. Now let me go ahead and call this endpoint again, and we see what we have. Here we can see the user, that is the authenticated user, and this user has the row user, but the required rows says admin or editor. That is this guy over here, admin or editor, but this user has only user row. This is why we get the 403 forbidden. Now let's test the same thing with a user that has the right privileges. And this is John Doe. And I'll log in and find the authenticated user. This time it is John Doe. You can see it has admin and editor, so on and so forth. If I send this request again and we look at John Doe rows, of course, John Doe has the required rows. Let me view from here. Has the admin and editor. And one of them is what we need. I'll continue this and go back here. You can see that John Doe can access the route. We have successfully implemented role-based access control. Congrats to us. Now let's see how to implement claim-based control. In the claim-based example, we are going to check for permissions. This is a combination of the permissions that the user has by the virtue of the roles assigned to that user, as well as the permissions directly attached to the user. The implementation is similar to roles implementation. So I'm just going to copy this and rename the file. Let me call this permissions.guard.ts. Like that. This. Come on. I will do something similar for the decorator. I'll copy and paste that guy and call this permissions.decorator.ts. Then inside here, I'm just going to find and replace occurrences. So this is going to be permission and find row permission, finally row and permission. I'll do something similar for the permissions guard. So in this guard, find and replace the occurrences of row with permission. Everything looks good except down here. Right now, we're only checking the permissions directly assigned to the user. But remember that rows can also have permissions. So we need to check both. What I'll do is to simplify the code in this permissions guard actually. Let me have a helper. I'm going to call this helpers. Inside here, I'm going to have, let me call it auth.helpers.ts. And in the file, I'm just going to have this helper method, that this function that takes a user and extracts all the permissions from the user's roles and all the permissions directly assigned to the user and return a unique measure of the two. So in the permissions guard, instead of like this, I'm going to return required client permission.sum permission, and I'll check if the actually this is user permissions const user permissions equals to get client permissions user, and just pass request.user here. Remove this guy. So we say user permissions.has permission. We're using has here because this returns a set, because we want to return only the unique values. Now we can, let me go to app module and apply this guard. So similar to what we have for rows guard, I'm going to have permission guard. And then I will go to the controller. Let me also copy and paste this guy. I'll comment out this one for now, although we can combine the two if you so wish. And this is going to client permission dot whatever, create announcement. Why do I have an error here? Oh, this is permissions. Let's go ahead and give this a try. Once again, I will start with, let me start with the user that doesn't have that privilege. So this is going to be set, send the request. What is happening? I'm going to start this. Let me also attach the breakpoint here. And I'll start this. Go back to Postman and I'll log in. Then I'll find the authenticated user, which is this user, and I will try to fetch users. This brings us to the permissions guard, and we can see that these are the required permissions. Required permissions is permission.create.announcement. But this user has only one permission, permission.read.user. That means the request is going to be denied. If I continue here, we should get a 403. Go back to Postman, we get a 403 forbidden. But let's try this with the user, this admin user. Get the user, this is John Doe. Try to find the users. You can see that this user has the required permission to access this endpoint. So I will continue this and we go back to Postman. The user is able to access this. Let's demonstrate the case where two users can have different permissions, and it doesn't matter whether or not they have the same or different roles. So we have this Zest and John Doe IDs 1 and 3. I'll go to the table. Which table is that? Row, user, and permission table. Here I have John Doe and the permission name, let's say create announcement. So this user has create announcement permission. But let me change this to the user with ID 3, which is Zest. And I'll commit that change. If I go back to, let me start the application again. Start this. I'll go to Postman and let me log in as John Doe. I'll get the logged in user and we check the permissions. You can see that this, no, not John Doe. Okay, yeah, John Doe. So John Doe does not have the permission to create announcement anymore because we just removed it from the database. And if John Doe tries to find users, we look at the user permissions, there's no create announcement. So this is going to fail because the required permission is announcement, to create announcement. I'll go to Postman and this fails. And let's go to the other user, log in as this user, get the user. We can see a change here that this user now has permission assigned to it, the create announcement permission. And if I call this same endpoint, we should be able to get that data. So this user now has create announcement. This is coming from direct assignment to the user, and this other one is coming from the rows, and both of them are merged using the helper function. And we continue this and we go back, we can see that we have the list of users. So far, we've seen how to do role-based access control and how to do claim-based authorization. Now let's look at more fine-grained authorization using this library, CASL. I'll copy, let me stop this guy, and go to the terminal. So I will install the CASL package. Let me see what next I need to install. We already have a user, and I'm going to use user in this example. Let me ignore this guy. Now we'll go ahead and define some actions using this example here. We'll see how to apply this in a moment. So let me go to, let me say action, no, not here. That should be in the enums. Actions.enum.ts. So export. There's already an export. I'm going to organize the code for this CASL ability into a separate module. So I'm going to generate a module called CASL, and also just a class called CASL ability. I will take the example from NestJS documentation, this one here, and modify to suit our use case. So we have a class CASL ability factory created here, and inside that class we should have a method called create for user. This refers to the authenticated user. Then we have definitions of what a user can or cannot do. Now let me copy this example, head over to the code, go to the CASL ability factory and paste this here. Let me remove the spec file, not writing a test here. Then I'll fix the import, add all missing imports. Actions should come from the enum that we just created. Why do I get this? Close the file and open it again. Now I cannot find it. All right, we don't have an entity called article, so let me remove that guy. And down here we define what the user can or cannot do. For example, if the user is an admin, let's have a method called has role or has any role, so we can use that instead of this. The user can have multiple roles, remember. Let me create a role helper. Let me just have it here. Export const user has any role equal to this. This is going to take user and rows client row. The client in this application is user. So we return user.rows .sum row client no dot include row dot name. Here I'm going to say if user has any row, user, and what are the rows? Client dot, for example, admin. So if the user has admin row, the user can manage everything. In CASL ability, the library, this all is kind of a keyword. That means everything. Then by default, we can say if the user is not admin, then they can read everything. Here we don't have an entity called article, but we can use user. We can demonstrate the example here. So in this case, we don't want a user with ID 1 to access the profile for user ID 2, but user with ID 2 can access profile with user ID 2. Instead of this, I'm going to say user and ID to be equal to user ID. So the user with ID that matches the authenticated user ID can update the user. You are free to define more actions here. For example, if you have other entities like the article example we just saw from the documentation, so you are free to define what the user can or even cannot do. Let's see how to apply this, how to make use of this example. First, I will go to the module file and not there, here, providers, that is CASL ability factory, and also export that, export CASL ability factory. You notice that this is yet another injectable, the ability factory class. Then how do we use this? Because it's just an injectable, we can go to whatever method we want and inject this. Let me go to users once again, users controller. I'll just have another method at put async update profile. I'll not bother myself with this implementation, just demonstrate the CASL ability stuff. So I'll just return 1, 2, 3, whatever. But in the constructor, I can inject the CASL ability. Make sure to import that. Then in this method, I'll take the example from the documentation and fix the import. So first we get access to the user that is making this request, that is the authenticated user. I'm going to say at current user. Remember we implemented this in the authentication tutorial. User, so this is of type user. Now we have the user. We just want to check if the user can update. By the way, where is the action from? We have action. This is the enum, not RSJS. Update. In this action enum, we have a couple of actions defined, but let's test distinct things. So let me get this, move it over here, and let's have at current user. What I want to do is whether this user has the permission to read user or to read all. And this is the case we have over here. We say that an admin can manage everything, but any user can read everything. Later we are going to test this second case. So if the user does not have the ability to read, we are going to throw new forbidden exception. Then down here, what I want to do is to test this case, which is update user. Instead of update, let's even define something else. We can say update on or manage on. Let me just call update on. This is update on. I think that makes more sense. Update on record. Then I'll go to controller. I want to check if the user has the permission to update on, well, user record. So this is not going to be confused with the authenticated user. Let me call this user some user. Let me also update this so we can take ID of any user and try to update it. So this is going to take ID, and I'm going to say const some user. If this is another entity like article or product, whatever, this is what you try to get here. Coincidentally, we are trying to update user, an authenticated user trying to update another record, in this case coincidentally a user. So we say this dot user service dot find one. Actually, let's just hard code something here. So I'm going to say this is of type user equal to ID, and this is the ID that is passed at param ID of type number. I think this should come in as a string. So ID is cast that to a number, and username whatever. Let me see what we have here. Password is nullable, name is nullable, account status and permission. So one more thing here. Account status dot active. Now we have a user hard coded here for demonstration purposes, and I'll return that user. And what we want to do is to check if the authenticated user can update this record. That's why we passed that object over here. If we are checking if this authenticated user can update any user without regard to specific ID or a specific user, we pass the user class name here, the class here. But in this case, because we are checking a specific user, we pass it like this. If this were to be something, let's say const article to be equal to that, we pass a specific article. If we are not checking for specific article, but that the user can update any article, we pass like this. I hope this makes sense. I'm going to undo this and start the application, so we give this a try. Waiting for that to start. While that is starting, let me go to Postman, and I think we have an error. Okay, so in the users module, we need to import the CASL module to use it. CASL module. I think that error should go away now. The error is gone. I'll go back here. What do we have? Let me start with this user and get the authenticated user. According to the find users endpoint, any user has the read permission. I'm going to remove all these guys. By the way, in this, let me remove the other this thing. We are not making use of the role based and the permission stuff for now. I'll go back and call the endpoint again. We get the list of users. Let's see what happens if we change that rule. If we change the rule, I'm just going to comment out this thing here, save, and the application restarts. And I go back here, you can see that I get forbidden because now we did not assign those permissions to the user. Before I test the other case, I want to point out one thing. If, for example, in all the cases where the user does not meet the permission, I'm going to throw an exception like this. I'm just going to maybe make a helper function for this, put it somewhere so I don't have to repeat all these codes. Just something to have in mind if you prefer to do that. I'm going to say something like permission denied. But because I have two simple use cases here, I'm just going to copy this. Just going to copy only this. Come down here and paste. Change this to if not have the ability. Now what I want to test next is this endpoint, trying to update a profile, a user profile. I'll go back here and let's once again see the authenticated user has ID 3. I'll try to update a user with ID 3 first. I'll send this request. Why did I get this? Authentication is the problem. So this takes a bearer token, the bearer token from the environment variables. What I got is permission denied. That's a bit weird. Let me see why. Let me go to here, put a breakpoint here and call the endpoint again. This is the ID, the parameter. Then we have some user, which is this user. It has ID 3. And we have the authenticated user has ID 3. So what is the problem? I'm not sure why I got that error. Okay, I finally figured out the problem. This, if you look here, you can see the way I created the user. I just created an object instead of instantiating the user from the user class. So, and that is the problem. Right now, this is what we have. If I run this code and let me just continue, we get a 403 forbidden. I think I've seen this somewhere in the documentation, but I just can't find it now. That the way to create this is to instantiate a user. So instead of this object here, I'm going to create an instance of user, and you can populate whatever fields you want, but this is the important one because in the ability factory, I am checking that record, the user matches the authenticated user ID. Now go back and try this one more time. And this is the authenticated user, and this is the example user. So the ID they match in this case, I should get the permission should pass. I got this response, but now let this user with ID 3 try to update a user with a different ID. The authenticated user is this, once again with ID 3, and now we are trying to update a record that doesn't belong to that user. I'll continue this. You can see that we get a 403 forbidden. Okay guys, with this example we've covered the 3 different approaches. We started with the role-based access control by just checking the role, and we have also seen how to check permissions in claim-based access control. Finally, we did something more fine-grained using the CASL ability factory. I hope this makes sense. Until next time, enjoy coding.